Welcome back to The Vote Matters. I'm your host, Tia Sneum. Sitting alongside me today is the producer. Here at The Vote Matters, we talk about political topics through a nonpartisan and entertaining manner to empower you, the voter. Today's topic of discussion will be the tariffs.
So I think you could see in the news or in the media lately, they've been putting a lot of information out there around the tariffs and how it's basically going to raise everybody's cost of living, right? Because supposedly with tariffs, all the imports that we use will basically cost more because we levy a fine or a penalty for those imports. But I think there's like a lot of misinformation about that. That is true, what I just said, and it is true what they say, but I don't think that is the only aspect of this when they think about tariffs.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess we're all curious, one of the main things that Trump was running on was these new tariffs that he's going to try and implement, especially with in Europe, it seems like he wants to fix the tariff situation that's occurring over there, right? Especially when it comes to the automotive aspect of things.
Well, yeah, I think when you look at protecting your industries, right? Often companies or countries will put up tariffs in order to protect certain segments of industry because this is where people work a lot, right? And they don't want to have those jobs lost. So let's say the car manufacturing side, or that would be like Germany. They want to protect their automotive industry. France does the same thing. You also have certain tariffs that are, for example, in Korea or in Japan related to steel. They basically want to push those products because they're huge industries within their countries, and they want to make sure people are employed. Mm-hmm. So, sometimes to the detriment of our own unions and our own companies. Like, for example, American steel has been around for almost 120-something years, right? It was founded by J.P. Morgan. And that industry is at the point of collapse. I mean, literally, it's almost non-existent. And a lot of it has to do with all these countries that are pushing their steel here, but we're not able to export our steel there because of tariffs. So it becomes sort of an unfair trade balance, mm-hmm. right? And so I think those are things that we're looking at when it comes to tariffs is how do we protect our industry? How do we protect our jobs?
No, wasn't it true that these tariffs were kind of put in place post-World War II, right? There's this, I forget what the act is called, but there was something that I was reading into and looking into where it said that the U.S. placed tariffs upon their own economy so that then Europe's economy could fix itself after World War II, rather than having a dilemma such as what happened after World War I, where Europe just was decimated and it couldn't regrow its economy, especially in Germany and those Eastern European nations.
Yeah. So what the U.S. basically implemented after World War II was a thing called the Marshall Plan. And it's exactly what you're saying, where we really still had a very intact industry, right? We were basically pumping out cars, we're pumping out planes, we're just manufacturing everything because we didn't really get impacted by the war, right? We didn't have buildings bombed. We didn't have our roads decimated, our infrastructure torn apart. So as part of the Marshall Plan was to try and give a little time for those countries like Japan, Korea, you're talking about European nations, right? Mm-hmm. An opportunity to regrow sort of vital segments of their economy in order to basically generate revenues and use that to build out their infrastructure again. So yeah, absolutely. Marshall Plan was a fantastic idea. But a lot of that, to your point, policy is still around to this date. And it's almost like I don't think you really need it because these are very healthy countries. They are very innovative countries. They are able to adopt and basically grow without sort of tariffs.
And that's kind of what Donald Trump is trying to change, correct?
To some degree. It's a lot more than that. So, for example, if you look at tariffs are actually what I would say is a big portion of his foreign policy. Mm-hmm. So let's say if you wanted to stop the war in Ukraine, right? You could basically say, hey, look, we're going to raise tariffs on anybody that's going to be selling weapons to the Ukrainians that are going to prolong this war, or we're going to put tariffs against China or against Iran or other people that are supporting Russia. So you could use these tariffs to drive foreign policy, right? Think about like Canada and Mexico. So what's Trump get into office? He hasn't really taken the presidency, but what was the first thing he spouted? He's like, hey, I'm going to throw tariffs against Canada and Mexico. And why did he do that? Because he's like, Mexico needs to protect our border. They need to stop these caravans coming through their country and invading our nation. So how do I make Mexico do what I want them to do? If they don't, I'm going to throw up tariffs and I'm going to impact their economy severely. And, you know, it's all part of the deal, right? Remember that's his book, The Art of the Deal? So he uses tariffs also to drive policy. And I think that's a big portion of his foreign policy is around tariffs, so that he can use it to sort of create better habits around the world so that it is not as, like we're not sitting there going to war to resolve things. We can resolve these things through negotiations.
I see. And then I guess, yeah, bringing it back to the common citizens and the common people, how would these tariffs be impacting us here?
Sure. To your point, anything that are basically a tariff means there is going to be an additional cost to bring it into this country. So that means it's going to be passed on to the consumer. At the same time, what happens is some of these people that are manufacturing overseas, like American companies using overseas cheap labor or access to resources that they would manufacture it, let's say in China, and then ship it to the US, but there was no tariff, so it was a lot cheaper for them to do it that way. Well, they might say, hey, because of the tariffs, it might be easier or better to manufacture that in the US. So even though the cost of that good might go up, it also might drive growth in the manufacturing base within the United States, which has been completely decimated over the last 20, 30 years. It's just really been gutted out of the Midwest, right? So what you're seeing is this could basically change where manufacturing is around the world to say it's not all in China or it's not all in India. But now because of tariffs, you can start driving that some back to your home. Now, Europe does do that. Europe protects its sort of industry.
Market.
Yeah, and they protect their market by using tariffs in order to make sure that doesn't go offshore and people lose their jobs, right? So it's not like an unknown use of tariffs. This has been around a long time. It's just Donald Trump is willing to use this as part of his foreign policy, as part of his economic stimulus, as part of, you know, really different ways of raising taxes as well. So it's really interesting. His perspective on tariffs is quite different than I think just sort of how it's explained in mainstream media, because there's a lot more to it than just saying, oh, it's going to raise goods. He's going to shut these, you know, tariffs on these countries and the cost will go up. There's other consequences related to this. There's other tangible aspects, foreign policy. I think the thing in the Middle East, like how do you stop a war in the Middle East? Well, if I say, hey, you can't import your oil, that'll put a lot of pressure on Saudi Arabia. That puts a lot of pressure on other foreign players who basically are trying to push and get oil consumption within the United States. So that means if you bring a big player like Saudi Arabia to the negotiation tables, that's huge. That's huge. It also does the same thing for Iran. Iran's like, how can I export my oil if we're going to have these tariffs on that product, right? So again, that brings even Iran to the negotiation table. Are you always going to get everything you want by using tariffs? Of course not. But at least you're going to get them to the table. And that's the first thing you have to do. So I think that's what I see as it's huge for his foreign policies.
Kind of puts them in check a little bit, right?
Absolutely.
Now, I guess the real question, too, is since it seems like it's a way to get people to the table, like it almost sounds somewhat of an instigator for proxy wars, right? Like if, let's say, Saudi Arabia is no longer able to distribute their oil, right, and it, you know, causes a big hit to their economy, what are some different routes of, like, going about this to where their economy can still be stable without creating a conflict that could wind up being, you know, very destructive?
Well, I think that's the whole point, is to not get to that stage, right? And I don't think it's like, oh, we're gonna, put these huge tariffs on Saudi Arabia or on China to the point where it's detrimental to their economy and they collapse. I don't think that's the game plan. I think the game plan is just to basically say, hey, we need to have a better
Dialogue.
relationship. And this is a way for me to have a better relationship with you, because otherwise you won't listen to me. So it's sort of carry a big stick, but be willing to use it if you need to. And they know that he's willing to use it, and so they're going to negotiate for, things that are reasonable, right? We can't sit there and undermine their economy, undermine their government, undermine that, because that doesn't work for us either, right? That's not the way that you want this all to work out. And with the U.S. being the largest consumer of energy, the largest consumer of general materials in the world and products, that is a tremendous amount of influence that we could have over the world with regard to using tariffs. Just because people need to sell their products to us in order for their economies to survive.
I see. Gotcha. No, it's all interesting stuff. I mean, any other important things people should know about, like, what a tariff is, how, it's going to be utilized going forward? Like, any other important things?
Yeah, so tariffs are just generally to protect your market, right? Protect your industries, protect jobs. But the other thing, too, is you got to remember, sometimes other countries don't use tariffs, but they use subsidies. So, for example, if you go and look at, let's say, Europe, right? And you look at the manufacturing airline industry, I think it's, Airbus? That's all subsidized. That's all subsidized by France, Great Britain, and Germany, right? And that makes them be able to develop it because they have an unlimited amount of money coming in from the taxes they raise to subsidize that industry because they think it's so important for them. But at the same time, that puts Boeing at a disadvantage because Boeing doesn't get that kind of subsidies. And so it's like, how does Boeing compete against these subsidies? So that's also where tariffs come in to try and equalize that playing field, right? We have the same thing with regard to our relationships with Canada. There are certain things that are subsidized in Canada and they export to the U.S., and it sort of decimates our industries. This would be like the milk industry. This would be the steel, aluminum industry. So how do you balance that act between countries subsidizing certain industries versus countries trying to keep their industries but not subsidize them? You do it through tariffs. So you have a balancing act that way as well. So it's always trying to get to that equilibrium so that everybody benefits from it. And yeah, I don't think it's a bad thing to do, like everybody's, oh, prices are going to be outrageous, I don't think it's going to get to that point. But it is going to be part of all the changes that we'll see for sure as part of the first year of this administration. I think he's coming right out the gate with tariffs to start driving his foreign policy. It's very obvious he's tackling things that related to, like, how can I stop Ukraine war as soon as they get into office? Well, tariffs is a very big way to influence a lot of the people, the big players that are part of this whole Ukrainian-Russia war, right? Same thing for the Middle East. How do you
Like the whole, I guess, with the whole Palestine-Israel thing, tariffs would be a good...
Yeah, if you can basically stop the oil from, let's say, Iran, and put tariffs and say, we're not only just tariffs, but boycott or embargo or whatever the case may be. You bring them to negotiation tables, and remember, a lot of the things related to Hezbollah, the Houthis, all these things are funded a lot through Iran. So by having a significant influence on Iran, you can quail down a lot of things. And at the same time, the biggest enemy of Iran is Saudi Arabia. So if you can also bring them to the table, and remember, they're also big oil exporters, you basically have got a good thing going to try and keep the Middle East in a way that is not so, let's say, volatile, right? And that's a really good thing for all the people in the Middle East. They don't need this continuous volatility. They've had enough of continuous wars. They've had enough continuous proxy wars. They need time to basically, have stable lives raise families, and, live the life that they need to live, not the life that's been forced upon them.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll see what happens going forward, but if everything you're saying is, the strategies that will be implemented, I think it'll finally bring a little bit of peace and balance to this world. So, to our viewers, thank you guys for listening, and be sure to keep up with all the upcoming content that we will be dropping. As always, the vote matters. Stay tuned for upcoming content.